using this gizmo. And yes, it was named for laundry detergent. The Xenon 1T dark matter experiment. Researchers set up 2 tons of ultra pure, hold that thought, liquefied xenon in a vat under a mountain in Italy, which sounds like a pretty cool research gig. Xenon is a noble gas that is extremely stable, which makes it the perfect candidate to detect the presence of any particles that pass through it, because it doesn't interact with anything. The team announced that they found a surprising excess of particles interacting with the xenon. And they can't explain this using the standard model of physics. Possibilities for these results include neutrinos, well-documented phenomenon, the axion at long last, or plain old tank contamination. And so I kind of vote for tank contamination, but we'll see. One of the most interesting objects in the solar system continues to be fascinating. Saturn's largest moon, Titan, shows features at both poles that appear to be craters, such as you see in this photograph, indicative not of impacts, but of cryovolcanism. The close association with proposed volcanic craters with polar lakes is consistent with a volcanic origin through explosive eruptions followed by a collapse. Planetary Scientists Institute senior scientist Charles A. Wood said of this research, the apparent freshness of some craters, because with its methane cycle, Titan changes, the volcanism may have been relatively recent, even continuing today. So that is super cool. Meanwhile, a decades-old mystery about this large moon may have been solved. 20 years ago, bright patches were noticed around Titan's equator. At the time, they were dubbed anomalously specular radar reflections. And they looked like lakes, but when Cassini visited Titan in the early part of this century, Cassini found scant evidence for lakes near the equator. Polar lakes, yes. Equatorial lakes, no. Possibilities for these bright patches included dunes and transient puddles of methane rain. But modeling of Titan's atmospheric conditions just didn't work. So, faced with the scant evidence for massive puddles and the scant evidence for dunes, researchers are zeroing in on the idea that these bright spots are instead dried lake beds. Getting a little more esoteric here. You may have heard of the cosmic baby. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer. It's actually quite old and quite dead, but astronomers have detected light from a magnetar all of 240 years old. Hold that thought. Suite of space-based telescopes operated by NASA and the European Space Agency have discovered the youngest known magnetar to date. This cosmic infant could help astronomers understand how these dead, dense stars with the incredible magnetic fields came to be. Magnetars are a rare kind of neutron star, the collapsed cores of huge stars and fairly rare on their own, with extreme magnetic fields like seen in this artist's rendering. They pack a huge amount of mass into a tiny space, which generates a lot of, shall we say, weird physical properties. These magnetic fields can be up to 1,000 times stronger than those of your regular neutron star. Now, this particular magnetar is only about 16,000 light years from Earth, so it's practically in our backyard in the constellation Sagittarius. So yes, it's taken 16,000 years for the light to get from it to us, but the light we are receiving, the snapshot, is as it looked when it was about 240 years old, which is pretty cool. Astronomers have only detected a few dozen, none so young, and so this will add to a growing body of research about this really strange, extreme phenomenon. Magnetars are also one of the prime suspects in the mystery of fast radio bursts, these brief radio signals that flare to life, quickly disappear, and are sometimes claimed to be alien communications, it's hypothesized that the extreme environments around magnetars may be flinging these odd signals at the Earth. So a team of astronomers, including researchers at MIT, has picked up on a unprecedented repeating rhythm of fast radio bursts emanating from an unknown source outside our galaxy, a solid 500 million light years away. So they discovered it using CHIME. CHIME is the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment. It's a radio telescope in British Columbia, as seen in the spiffy artist rendition. It's the first to produce a periodic or cyclical pattern of fast radio bursts. Here's CHIME as it actually looks. The pattern begins with a noisy 4-day window, during which the source emits random bursts of radio waves, followed by a 12-day period of silence. The astronomers observed that this 16-day pattern reoccurred consistently over 500 days of observations, precise as clockwork. That's all I got to say about that for right now. Moving on to In the Sky. Happy solstice, everybody. This Saturday, June 20th, marks the summer solstice for those of us above the equator, the winter solstice for those below the equator. If you have ever wanted to take in the solstice from fabled Stonehenge in the UK, this is your year, not because you can go, because you can't, but because they will be streaming it for the first time ever. It's a pretty cool thing, and you don't have to worry about hanging out with a bunch of people in a stone circle at dawn. Sounds good to me. For those of you who'd like to appreciate the solstice with an event a little closer to home, the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House is doing a virtual cocktail party that evening. All right, so we have an annular eclipse coming up. We will not be enjoying it. It is Eastern Hemisphere only. In fact, it will be seen Central African Republic, Congo, Ethiopia, Southern Pakistan, Northern India, and China. So an annular eclipse is the same geometrically as a total eclipse, except that the moon is a little too far away from the Earth in its elliptical orbit to thoroughly blot out the sun. And so you get this incredible ring of fire effect as seen from this picture in the US annular eclipse of 2012. This particular one on the 21st is the moon will be close enough that the ring will be very small. So astronomers may see an effect like this of Bailey's beads, these bright bits of light surrounding the rim of the moon all around the sun. And other cool phenomenon from how very narrow the solar disk is. However, even though animals may be exhibiting weird tendencies, birds, insects, everything like that, the sky will get very dim, though perhaps not dark enough to see actual stars. This is still absolutely unsafe to look at without a proper optical aid of eclipse glasses or a solar filter. Any part of the sun uncovered is going to be hazardous to your eye. Only a total eclipse is safe to look at during totality. This is not. However, again, thanks to travel restrictions, I don't think any of us will be fortunate enough to see this. But just in case somebody's listening in from the eclipse zone, be prepared. And finally, if you missed the earlier conjunction of Pluto and Jupiter, the king of planets and the most infamous dwarf of planets, you have another chance. On the 30th, Pluto and Jupiter will be in a close conjunction, the second of 3 this year. The first was in April. The last will be, I think, November. And should be fun. Jupiter and Saturn are hanging out low in the southern sky, along the ecliptic, of course. And from our latitudes, they're easy enough to see by midnight, which, thanks to the solstice, is about when things get dark anyway. So, that is in the news and in the sky for this latter half of the month. Any questions? I had a request for annotation come through, but it was paralyzing my browser, so I could not accept it. So Ken Lord, did you have something you wanted to add? Nope. Don't hear anything? Okie dokie. Well, if nobody has any questions, we can go back to the normal order of business with the officers' reports. So as your president, we've been, keeping abreast of things, potential reopenings, collaborations with other clubs, keeping up thanks to Bob Tremblay and Adrian Bradley on what's going on with astronomy at the beach. I think, is Adrian, are you on the call tonight? Excellent, excellent. So Adrian wrote a magnificent piece on why astronomy at the beach is going to have to be a virtual event this year. He's given us permission to publish it in the WASP and on our email blast, so you will be receiving it. It is a very well thought piece on why it is not yet safe for clubs such as ours to be resuming normal operation of business in terms of outreach, interactions with the public. Riyadh can touch on the Stargate rules at present, but we are starting to get requests from people as Michigan reopens in general for supporting events. At this time, we do not feel that these can be done safely, especially not inside the enclosure of Stargate, and we are not doing it. And the leadership of Astronomy at the Beach similarly is not doing it, and other entities up to and including, as Bob Tremblay has pointed out, the Vatican Observatory is keeping in virtual mode, at least for the time being.
Diane, can you hear me?
Yes, Jim.
Did you see the email I sent to the IO group about the way the Grand Canyon Star Party treated the virtual star party?
Yes.
Excellent way, had a lot of meaning for people, for fellow amateur astronomers. It was done quite well with 3 people, all of whom had it was a very carefully crafted thing. If anyone hasn't looked at it, you might take a look at it as a model for something we might consider. And that's an event about the size of astronomy at the beach.
Yes. Yeah, no, that was excellent, Jim, and it was very good to see that other states are, again, being creative in ways to craft meaningful astronomical interaction without putting anybody at any sort of harm's way. Okay. So our Dale Parton, our first vice president program chair, is bringing you on July 6th a great debate, one more time, on whether we should send people to Mars. John Blum will be the referee. The pro-Mars team will be Jim Shedlowski and Dale Parton himself. The anti-team will be Ken Burton and Bob Tremblay. This should be very entertaining. On July 16th, Jonathan Cade will give a presentation entitled Interstellar Objects I Have Sort of Known, during which I hope we learn the latest on Oumuamua in depth.
After you got spoilers.
Hey, it was in the news.
Nice job on the Hawaiian pronunciation, Diane.
Thank you. I've studied it. Okay. Riyadh is on the line. Normally, I do give all of the officer reports for them at a Macomb meeting. So we are not yet resuming physical Stargate. We have done periodic checks. Riyadh and Jeff McLeod both have gone up there to make sure everything is in order and everything is secure. Riyadh, do you have anything you'd like to add about either the Double Star Group or Stargate itself?
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
At Stargate, I was there yesterday, went to check the observatory. Both buildings are fine. The only thing I noticed is the front door had jammed a little bit at the bottom, so I didn't force it to open it, but it's locked. It's okay. I think it's just expansion from heat. It's something that we may have to look into later on and try to fix. Otherwise, both buildings are fine. Equipment is okay. No leaks. Everything is okay so far.
And
Yeah,
Riyadh, what are
go
your
ahead.
recommended recommendations in case any members do want to go out there and use the site itself?
Yeah, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's not really up to us. It's up to the park, and the park right now is, as far as I know, is open. So anybody could go there as long as the front gate is open. You can go there, and we have outlets on both buildings that if you need electricity, you can plug into and use that electricity. You don't have to be inside the building. And if, as usual, if somebody from the park or the ranger stops by and asks questions, just let them know that you're a member of the Warren Astronomical Society and you are allowed to use the park for observing. Other than that, it's still, of course, closed, as we mentioned, because the building is so small. It's only 12 by 12 on the inside. So putting in there more than a couple of people, it becomes already too crowded. So for now, it's going to remain closed.
So as Riyadh said, members are free to use it for their own personal enlightenment. Just don't bring your friends, and we're not inviting the public in at this time.
Right.
Thank you, Riyadh. Okay. Secretary Glenn Wilkins has done his usual phenomenal job of turning in the minutes promptly and with great detail. So the Cranbrook minutes have already been turned in, and Glenn is in the exploratory phase of contacting people for banquet prizes in hopes that we can have a normal-ish banquet at the end of the year, or at the very least a well-deserved celebration of this club making it through 2020. Treasurer Mark Jakubison, I don't think I see him on the call. The details on our treasurer report can be found in the WASP. Bob Tremblay, Outreach.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Bob.
Well, if anybody's done any outreach, now would be the time to say it because I haven't been doing any. I am going out of my mind not being able to set up my telescope and show the neighbors.
I'm giving a presentation on Zoom tomorrow for the lowbrows.
Can you email anybody who's doing that? Please email me information on that so I can include it in the newsletter next month.
Actually, tomorrow. So.
Well, anything that y'all are doing, please report it to Bob the way that you would normally report giving a presentation to a library or a fellow astronomy club or whatnot. It's
I have actually created a flyer, which I think we might want to do for some of our members. If you'd be interested in having if you've got a talk you've given over and over, like I have, if you'd like a flyer for it, let's talk.
Hey, Bob?
Yes.
I'm getting, Ken just mentioned he's giving one to the lowbrows. I'm giving one to a Ford Club next week, and I could send you an email or send IO a link to that. As with Ken's thing, you can check in on that.
Yeah, guys, let's sort that out during the break. But yes, please get that into Bob, but let's sort out the details during the break or offline so we can keep going with the business meeting.
Do we want to send them directly to Bob, or do we want to do it to IO?
Send it to Bob. Bob is keeping a list. Bob keeps our outreach stuff in a spreadsheet so that we're getting credit for what we do. So if you want to share with the IO, that's also awesome. But definitely get it to Bob. Everybody, Dale, all of you. Cool.
Just thinking, IO gets it directly to everybody.
Okay. Anything else from outreach, Bob?
No, not that I can think of.
All right. Publications. The WASP is out. The WASP is taking submissions. Does publications have anything else to add? I see I see 2 thumbs up. Anything else there, Jonathan?
I have something with my AL hat.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Astronomical League membership renewals are due at the end of the month. I realize this might not be a good time to get stuff in through the mail. I have gotten a couple of renewals. If you are interested in renewing your Astronomical League membership or joining for the first time, please let me know ASAP. I have also asked the AL for an extension until July 31st to do a renewal because we have very few renewals so far. So hopefully they will approve that. And just for the record, it's $7.50 for 4 full color issues of the Reflector per year. The ability to participate in observing programs and other recognition programs, which I hope to enroll some of you soon, and the ability to attend at the Astronomical League convention, which I think is going to be virtual this year, but next year it'll be in person. And that's it for the Astronomical League yet. Might as well do merchandise while I'm here. We still have glow tape. We have some stickers. I'm looking into getting new stickers made. I know I say that every 6 months or so, but it's really true this time. And the glow tape is super useful. We did a lot of observing this weekend with one telescope that had glow tape and 2 telescopes that didn't, and it really made a world of difference. So I need to buy some myself, and you should too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, merch guy, I need some glow tape for my 10-inch because I tripped over it in the dark and that was no fun. Okay. All right, so special interest groups. Solar Captain Marty is not on, but he reported to me last night there's nothing going on of any interest on the sun other than the eclipse that we are not going to see. Double star group, that's Riyadh's turf. We'll be reconvening when we can meet safely. Otherwise, check out double stars yourself. There are plenty of them up right now, including Aljaba and Leo, Porama and Virgo, and a lot of other beautifully placed ones in the spring and summer sky. History subgroup, History Captain Dale Teamy reports he's got at least 12 copies of old DAS, Detroit Astronomical Society issues. The processing is soon to commence. That is going to be fascinating. And that brings us to, I think all we've got left is GLAC, since discussion group reported. Oh, and astrophotography. Do we have an astrophotography report? I did not get one in the mail.
I can say a few things with Diane.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm televising. I'm up at the observatory this week. We've had some really nice weather, 5 days, and I heard the weather downstate was just as good. So I hope all you guys and gals are getting out there with your DSLR cameras on your tripods and stuff like that, because Saturn and Jupiter are coming up real nice, very close together. And then later in the morning, Mars is coming up real nice with Neptune pretty close to it. So it's the opportunity to get out there with your cameras and put your cameras in your telescope and try out some astrophotography. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of me through the WADs and by email, and then we go from there. We've had some pretty nice weather.
Indeed. Thank you very much for the call to action, Bill. I think Jonathan is slowly succumbing to the call of astrophotography.
Good luck.
Yeah. And that takes us to discussion group. Discussion groups have replaced virtual open houses on weekends that are not favorable. So discussion group like this one, taking place on Discord or in a different form of chat, may pop up at any time. Stay tuned to your email for that. And finally, we've got GLAC. Bob, give us the lowdown.
Okay, I was at the last meeting on June 11th, and one of the things that they would like member groups to start doing is collecting information on presentations that their members would be willing to give online. seems to be the way it's going. So if you would like to give a presentation at Astronomy at the Beach, Friday or Saturday night, or it doesn't have to be night anymore, it can be all day, get me information. And again, this goes into this I'm making a flyer. So
they're all in auditorium,
Gang,
usually.
mute
Not
yourself.
all at their house.
So anyway, we are going to be, Black would like information on member presentations. We are looking into possibly doing some registered Zoom sessions to prevent the Zoom bombing, but again, we're not really sure what we're going to do about that yet. One of the things I suggested we do on the GLAC homepage was put up some resources. Like the VOF has a page on one of their sites, and what I'd like to do is, if you have an interesting astronomy website that you go to all the time, send that to me. Okay.
Will it be open in August?
One of the things doing youth programming, and I tweaked John Blum about getting his granddaughter to do something with that. But if you know anybody who would be interested in doing providing youth programming of any sort, again for GLAC or for this resource page, give me information. And again, best videos from YouTube. Again, if you've got videos you constantly send people to, get those to me. We'd like to make a fairly comprehensive resource page there. Other than that, GLAC is going to be going, instead of a 501c3, they're going for an LLC registration, and that way they'll be able to get a bank account. We'll be able to give them their money. So there was absolutely no problem with us giving them their money back. So that's GLAC in a nutshell.
That is an interesting solution. All right. Thank you.
Although they might have to pay tax on it, so
Yeah.
if they know a tax lawyer, they should talk to them.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much for that, Bob. That takes us to observing reports. I have one to read on behalf of the esteemed Gary M. Ross, aka the greatest planetary observer in the tri-state, soi-disant. Composite Jupiter report, 3 through 8th of June. Veen Observatory, 5-inch Newtonian, magnification of 100 times. Views of the giant planet varied widely over 5 days. The moon phase was full in the middle of those days and shared the low ecliptic with him, that being Jupiter. Seeing spanned good to poor. Southern hemispheric hood was seen, probably a durable feature based on years of observing. Too extensive in latitude to be a polar cap. The dusky expanse begins at the south temperate belt, extending toward the pole as far as foreshortening will allow for low magnification. Except one morning, most of the period saw the north equatorial belt subdued, the same as the south equatorial belt. On the one deviation, dark turbulence spread uniformly along the belt, disappearing before intersecting the planetary limbs. This indicates possible lower elevation within the belt, a curdled depression, making the transient feature difficult to see because of foreshortening. One morning, there is a hint of yellow streak in part of the south equatorial belt. Moreover, the equatorial zone displayed a vague greenish tint, though uncertain. The features encouraged application of a deep green filter. The result was striking. As expected, the filter brought out the longer wavelength colors in the equatorial belts, now also sharper. But the real discovery was how lime green the equatorial zone became. No details could be seen in the cloud tops at such low magnification, and because of seeing limitations. Meanwhile, with the Galilean moons, on one occasion Europa and Ganymede were close, if not in conjunction. It is notable how different they are. Brightness is a function of albedo and size. Europa is obviously smaller than Ganymede, as said previously, a satellite bigger than Mercury. Even at 100 times, the difference in diameters is obvious. But the ice world has an albedo of 0.67, so reflectivity, to Ganymede's 0.43, far brighter than our own moon. What Europa Lax in size is complemented 4 by a planetary scale polar cap. The opposite was an eastern elongation of Callisto with its albedo of 0.17, a dim globe. The circumfull moon was also low in the southern sky those days, so the moon glow made Jupiter's blue moon look anonymously dim. The uninitiated could be excused for thinking Callisto a field star. That's an observing report. Can anybody top that? Try it.
You'll have to unmute yourself if you're going to try it. I will say, I would like to share a tale of observing failure. I was up in true dark skies this weekend. The sky looked very good to me. The Milky Way was extremely well defined. You could resolve individual stars in the star clouds with the naked eye. It didn't. There was a lot of scintillation lower, but at the zenith, it didn't seem too bad. And I just couldn't see anything. Everything seemed blurry, and galaxies seemed indistinct. It's possible that I was getting too much light pollution. I was getting my eyes blasted by a nearby light, and that was keeping me from fully dark adapting. That may well be what happened, but you know, it was just an interesting phenomenon because I'm not used to having trouble of that nature up there. So, which is just to say, maybe if your observing sessions sound like that, check to see whether your dark adaptation might be getting blown out by something, because it can ruin an otherwise wonderful observing.
Can confirm. All right. Any other observing reports? Bill, Doug, I know some of our
I've
stalwarts
got
are on the
one.
line.
I'm on my way now, and I'm listening in while I head to Lake Hudson for maybe the third or fourth time in a row since we've had this great weather.
Fabulous.
Gonna be doing binocular astronomy. I downloaded a list, and I will see what I can see and pick out through binoculars this time. I have some 15 by 70s.
All right. Those are my favorites.
Hey, Diane.
Yes.
I imaged a cool galaxy trio this week, if you want me to show that. Kind of cool.
Please. Yep. Do I turn the presenter's ball over to you to show you that? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I can't. There we go.
Yeah, you should be able to just start presenting.
Can you guys see that?
Yeah, and we can still hear you too. So.
Yep.
Okay, good. This is called the Draco Trio. Now, what we have here in one field of view, which I thought was really cool, is the spiral galaxy, the elliptical galaxy, and the edge-on galaxy. Now, what's neat about this, if you look at these, you think, wow, these are right next to each other. Where in reality, the spiral down here is 140 million light years away from Earth. Then comes the elliptical, 123 million light years. And then finally, the closest one to us is our edge-on galaxy, 112 million light years away. So the difference between this first one and the second one, or the third one here, is about 30 million light years. They just happened to be in line. I thought it was a cool image. I thought I'd share it with the group.
How far
That's great.
did you see 50?
Anybody have any questions on that?
How far did you say 5982 you got buzzed out? How far away is that?
5982 is 123 million light years.
Ah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That is a knockout group. I'm surprised that we don't see more of that group.
Yeah, that is a phenomenal picture.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just happened to be researching the other night. Well, what can I image tonight? And then I came across this in my atlas. So I think, man, that's pretty neat. The Draco Trio. Anyway, we've had some great weather up here, a lot of imaging going on, and tonight's supposed to be clear also. That's all.
So if the group wants, I can share a couple of Milky Way shots I've taken recently. I think I can present them through my phone.
Cool.
Yeah. Let me know if I'm a presenter. I'll see if there's an option for me to share content. Nice for images. Okay. So let's see. Here's some images. The two that I'll share are, I just pointed up at the Milky Way galaxy. It's 2020. So there's Jupiter and there's Saturn off to the lower left. And that's the natural light look. I tried it with a camera for infrared and I got that.
Adrian, I don't think we're seeing it yet.
Yeah, you've got the presenter's ball, but I don't see anything coming through yet.
Okay. Let me see if I can. And if it doesn't work, I'll just give up and send the pictures or something. But I'm seeing share content, photos. There we go. All right. Are you guys seeing anything?
There might be another. You might need to click one other thing, maybe.
Let's see.
There might be like a confirm button after you select share photos.
Okay.
There it goes. Yeah, there it goes.
Well, that's the one I wanted to show second. That is with a modded camera of the Milky Way, kind of zoom in of the core region and Jupiter and Saturn next to it. I see how this works. So now if I want to do the natural light version of that, I have to stop sharing. I have to go in, pick photos, and then pick the photo I want to share, which will be that one. Is okay, that one. And that is the natural light version. It's a little wider frame, and it's got you see Scorpius to the lower right, and there's Jupiter and Saturn to the lower left. So I've had a new toy to do longer exposures with of the night sky using my camera, hooking my camera to it, and I was able to pull in some pretty detailed images. So not trying to do that tonight, but I've had a chance to do some Milky Way imaging in all these clear skies. Here's one that I guess you could say I'm proud of because of the detail that I got. It's up and it's vertical, but that one was 100 some. I forget how many seconds that one was. I just pointed it and I made the final image a vertically standing image. Now that might be the type of Milky Way photo you get at a darker site with a lot less exposure. So I'm doing it by exposing for a lot longer and aiming basically at the core of the Milky Way that I can see from Lake Hudson. So that's my input.
That's awesome.
Fabulous. I am really looking forward to this year's calendar, you all.
Very nice, Adrian.
Thank you.
Very nice.
I got 1 minute, but we can go a couple. Let's hear it, Doug.
Yes.
Yep. Cool. All right, so that takes us to 8:15. It is now time for our informal snack break, where instead of somebody donating snacks to the club, you enjoy your favorite snack and favorite drink. in the privacy of your own place, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes for tonight's feature presentation. See y'all.
I miss bringing apples to you guys.
We
I
miss
miss
having
eating the apples.
I miss eating chips and other stuff that I'm not allowed to eat at home because it's too salty. It doesn't count. Sodium has no effect when you eat it at a club meeting, only if you eat it at home.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. And then if somebody is having a conversation unrelated to the meeting, I'll probably review them.
It's eating real loud.
Hey, Jonathan, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ken.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to apologize. I don't know what I did. I hit some annotate button. I have no idea what I did.
Is that a picture of the Cat's Eye Nebula?
It's the double cat's eye. So I actually have a question, well, two questions. One of them is, does anyone have any experience with all-sky cameras? Because I am thinking about putting up an all-sky camera for astronomy at the beach up north and doing a live feed from that for astronomy at the beach. And if you have one you would be willing to loan me that's not permanently installed, that would be super cool. But also,
I think I'd actually like to talk to you about that because NASA's got those all-sky fireball network where they have those all-sky cameras and they want them set in a triangular configuration, and Michigan doesn't have any of them.
Really?
So yeah, so I think it's Doug Cook is on the NASA meteoroid detection, whatever. But I can get you information on this all-sky fireball network, and he's looking for people to put them in.
well, so I guess the limiting factor is that I don't have internet up there and I don't even have power to the site yet. I might be able to have power to the site, but the internet would have to be tethered to my cell phone. So
that is one of the problems. They've got a whole bunch of requirements. You've got to have a time feed. You've got to have reliable power. You've got to have internet because it checks and sends to NASA. And yeah,
I mean, long term that might be an option. But right now, the internet infrastructure up there is so undeveloped. Like satellite internet is the only option for most people. So
that might be something for me to post in the WASP again. I posted something about that a couple of years ago. But if we have people with observatories in Upper Michigan, that would be something for them to think about.
Hey, Jonathan, are you looking to take a video with your all-sky camera, or what are you looking to do?
I mean, I would kind of like to do a video, or I mean, maybe do a live video stream, or maybe do just a time-lapse exposure.
Because I've known, they weren't online, but I've known a couple guys that have their all-sky cameras that go out up here to Cadillac, and they work very well. I mean, you get the whole sky, the Milky Way coming up, and everything all night long. So I don't know specific brands, but I can tell you the ones that they've got seem to work well.
Cool. If they, if you can ask them or direct me to them, that would be cool. The ones that I've looked at are, it seems like the low budget ones are about $1,000. There's one manufacturer that puts them on eBay for about $260, but I don't know how I feel. I don't know if I trust that one. And S-Big, like the S-Big color all sky is $2,500, which might be a little bit much unless it was going to be permanently installed. So
I would have thought you could get an all-sky cam for way under that kind of money.
I thought that too when I first started looking, and then but I mean, really? It's possible that I could just get a fisheye lens and a webcam or something, and try to hack something together myself. So it seems like the prices the prices are a little bit much, I feel like.
I agree.
But the other question I had was, does anyone have either the either the lens version of the sky darkness meter, or the version without the lens, the sky quality meter? Sorry. Yes.
I have a sky quality meter, yes, that I use religiously wherever I go.
Cool, because so basically, what's happening is the city of Detroit this last week, the city council voted to allow essentially unchecked installation of video billboards everywhere in the city of Detroit, and so a lot of us, I am a silent member of a group called Michigan Dark Skies, and so I wrote some letters to city council asking them to please not do that, and they did it. So we're kind of hoping to.
Oh, okay. Leave it on.
Start, we're kind of hoping to take measurements around the Metro Detroit area. Originally, I thought it was just in the city of Detroit, but they want measurements everywhere around the city as well to see if there's noticeable changes and how far out the noticeable changes go. Because even if it's too late for the Detroit area, it will be valuable data for any other cities that are considered similar.
Well, here's what I recommend, John. Since you're so involved in this, I think you should buy one of the meters. I mean, they're not all that expensive.
Yeah, I did too, but like I'm probably only going to be doing like downtown Detroit, Dearborn, and Grosse Pointe, and they want measurements from all over the Metro Detroit area. So like if people have them at home and can do them from home, it would be a little more efficient than trying to drive everywhere myself. So
I can definitely do a reading from New Baltimore, Chesterfield area and send it to whoever needs it.
Awesome. That sounds great.
So send me a link or something where I send my findings.
I will do.
John, I need a head count for YouTube.
All right, I have been messaging you. So we actually have 23 watching on YouTube right now. So I think the total at one point we had 27 people on here. I think somebody dropped and is going to rejoin. So we are. It looks like we're at 49 or 50 people total participating tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Mark, did you want to do any? Did you already get to try out presenting?
No, I hadn't tried out presenting. I'd only checked the audio briefly.
Okay, do you wanna try really quick, just to make sure everything's okay?
Sure. Let me give this a whirl. Okay. So can you see just the...
No, right now we're seeing your screen. We're seeing the PowerPoint screen.
Okay, so you can't see the little video of me in the right-hand corner or any of the WebEx buttons. You only see the PowerPoint.
No, we still see the video of you. But we don't see a presentation. We don't see the presentation view. Okay, yeah, that looks good.
Yeah,
so now we're seeing the presentation view. Yep. Yeah, okay. Everything looks.
Yeah, presentation looks good to me.
You see if I can get rid of a few things off my screen, because I see the presentation, then I see all of you over a quarter of my presentation.
Oh dear.
And then I see myself.
Yeah, you can drag, like you can change it to just the presenter view, and then you can like drag the window elsewhere.
All right, let me play with this for a few seconds. Okay, I've kicked that to the side. Very good. and with 5 minutes to spare.
Excellent. I think I'm going to grab a beverage before the rest of the program. So, see you in a minute.
All right, gang. Welcome back. It is once again the bottom of the hour, and we can reconvene for tonight's feature presentation. And this is the time that I turn things over to our first Vice President, Dr. Dale Parton, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Diane. Our speaker tonight is Mark O'Malley. Mark works as a buyer in the automotive industry. Prior to working in Michigan, he lived in Minnesota, Texas, Indiana, Missouri, of the Warren Astronomical Society since 2016. And his activities include not only stargazing, but hockey, organizing German language clubs, studying history, and volunteering as a mentor at Warren Mott High School. His topic tonight is the life and times of Wernher von Braun. Before Mark begins, I will briefly tell you that I heard von Braun speak at a university in Pittsburgh shortly after the Apollo 11 mission happened, which used the Saturn V rocket that he led in the development of. After his presentation on rocket development, both in Germany and then in the United States, someone in the audience asked him how he felt about the Nazis using his rockets to kill people during World War II. He replied, with some heat, the same way the Wright brothers felt when their airplane was used to kill people. I'll never forget that little occurrence. So Mark, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Dale, and thank you for that story. I was also hoping to use it as well, but you beat me to it, which is only fair as you were the witness to it. But my title is The Life and Times of Wernher von Braun. So, of course, he's one of those key figures of 20th century history. He's portrayed in media all over the place. So I had seen him from when I was a kid, portrayed in movies such as October Sky and The Right Stuff. So from that, I kind of got the feeling that he was this mastermind of every single German and American rocket built between 1940 and 1970, from the V2 to Saturn, with every single rocket in between. The reality isn't quite that extreme, but he certainly was all over the place and involved in a great many projects. So we're going to delve into who he was, which projects he was actually involved in, and then, of course, the big question for those involved in science and engineering, how was he able to have all these projects so well funded? Let's see if there we go. So just a quick introduction to the basic facts. So I know there's a bit of a range of people on this call. Some people are very familiar with his background. Others are in the middle. A few others have never heard of this guy before. So here are just the basic pieces of information to go through. So born March 23rd, 1912, in what was then the German Empire. Where he was born is now in Poland. He was the lead designer of Nazi Germany's V2 rocket in World War II. His next stop was as a designer at the United States Army Ballistic Missile Agency, where he was responsible for IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, Jupiter and Redstone. And he was also then the NASA designer responsible for the Saturn series, as Dale just mentioned. So, and after that, he died June 16th, 1977. So 3 very different stops along the way. So it's a very fascinating story for how these all tie together. But the main thing that makes this story just so fascinating for a lot of people is just trying to put together how this guy in the black suit in the foreground, hang out with all these fun dudes, within 18 years became this guy standing next to an American president. So that's one of the main things we're going to cover tonight. So his early life, as I mentioned, born March 23rd, 1912 in Wierzich, Posen, part of the Kingdom of Prussia. Now Wierzich, Poland. His father was a civil servant in the Kingdom of Prussia, stationed in this far eastern province. His father was also a former army officer, so was his grandfather, which isn't too unusual given that he was born into a noble family. You can sort of tell just by the length of his name that he's going to be from the higher echelons of society. And you can also see in his name the von, indicative of nobility. And then in there it even says Freiherr, which loosely translates as baron. So when he was born, again, the Kingdom of Prussia and the German Empire were still in existence, so those noble titles actually held meaning, so that granted more political power at the time. And so his father, as I mentioned, a civil servant, born 1878. That was Magnus Von Braun. He lived all the way to 1972, so he saw the success of his son's rockets in reaching the moon. His mother, Emmy, born 1886, she did not live to see the moon landings, but she did at least live to see the initial success in the United States. And he was born the second of three brothers. His older brother, Sigismund von Braun, born 1911, so a year older than Werner. He did not go into engineering. He became a civil servant, more like his father. And then after World War II, he became a foreign servant in the West German civil service and was ambassador to various countries, including to the United Nations. His younger brother, though, did go into engineering, including rocket engineering. That was Magnus von Braun. And he also worked for his older brother, Werner, both in Germany and the United States, before leaving rocketry and going to work for Chrysler and moving to Michigan, although he eventually retired to Arizona. So just a little more of the background of the world at this time. So Germany, as I mentioned, was an empire, but it still retained its old kingdoms. This dated back centuries and was included as part of the empire when it was unified only 41 years earlier by Bismarck. And since that time, Germany had become the world's foremost scientific and engineering center, particularly famous for advances in chemistry. Industrially, it had passed the United Kingdom and was considered to be on par with the United States. And like other powers, it was in possession of an empire in Africa and the Far East. So a very different world from what you and I know today. So a bit more of the early life. His mother was a major influence on him. She spoke 6 languages, had studied abroad, and most importantly, she was an amateur astronomer. So she was the one who gave Werner his first telescope and was also instrumental in pointing out the stars and the planets and really kindling that interest in him. His father was also an influence on him, obviously, just not quite to that extent. His father never seemed to have as much interest in going to the stars. He was hoping his middle son, as you can see in this picture, would go on to become a farmer, which was more typical for the landed gentry of the time. So this is a family photo taken about 1924. That's his older brother Sigismund on the left, Werner's in the middle, and that's his little brother Magnus on the right. One of the other influences from his mother was she got him into music, particularly teaching him piano, and he was well known for his great memory, even at an early age, being able to repeat and play great works of Bach on the piano. So in 1915, his father Magnus became a civil servant in Berlin with the Department of the Interior. This was a big step up in the world for him. Before he was tied to the Kingdom of Prussia, now he was tied to the imperial government in the capital. And this is also in Berlin where Werner first experimented with rocketry. So when he was 12 years old, he attached a group of sky rockets to a wagon, lit it, and sent it down a street as part of an experiment. It worked wonders, shot all the way down the street, terrifying everybody on it as it was a major pedestrian thoroughfare. He thought it was a very valuable experience. The police were a little less amused, and his father was also very unhappy picking him up from the police station that evening. That's the famous first experience. And soon thereafter, and perhaps partially as a result of some of these experiments, he was sent off to boarding school near Weimar. So there he excelled in music and in languages, but it was a failure at math and physics. So I don't find that too surprising, given that while he was interested in astronomy, he didn't understand at that age how the math and physics would support it. And with neither parent being an engineer or having any involvement in the trades, there was just no reason for him to comprehend its importance. That began to change, though, in 1925, after he received a book by a very famous rocket engineer, a German from Romania by the name of Hermann Oberth, and his book was The Rocket to the Planetary Spaces. This was the book that first introduced how showed how spaceflight could be achieved using mathematics and physics, the two things that Werner was failing at that point. And that's what really made the connection for him, and how he started to start applying himself at these two fields. And once he had that connection in his mind, his key interest, along with these two subjects, he rapidly began improving. And keep in mind that name Hermann Oberth, we're going to see it again soon. After completing some time at this first boarding school, his father found a second one that he liked more and sent Werner there. It was on the North Sea island of Spiegelhoog, and the main reason why his father liked it, it was much stricter. And Werner continued to excel while he was at that school, as he had the driving force, his interest in going to the stars. And one of the things that he was famous for when he was there was he helped build an observatory for that school. It was the deal they had with the school administration. Werner and some of his classmates would build the observatory in the dome, and then the school would donate a telescope to put into it. And you can actually go and look at some of these places. They're still here. This is where he went to his first boarding school. This is Schloss Edesburg near Weimar. The school has since decamped, but you can go and visit that building. And this is the island of Spiegelhoog. The school is still there. It does appear to be a little less strict now. When I was looking at it online, the principal appeared to have a ponytail, so I can't imagine his father would agree to send him to this school today. But it is still there. So, a little bit of what was going on in the world at this time now. We're in the 1920s. So Germany had lost World War I at this point, and with it, its empire and a lot of territory in Europe. So where Werner was born in Posen, it was now part of Poland, and there was a lot of economic instability in the country. However, he was shielded by a lot of that. One, he was still in school. Two, because his father's estates were still in Germany, in Silesia, which is that lower blue arm going off to the right. They still had the economic means to support themselves. So, what else was going on in Germany? Science fiction was becoming very popular. A 1921 movie by Fritz Lang called The Woman in the Moon was a huge hit. And something that was interesting for that movie was actually advised by several prominent scientists and rocket engineers, including Hermann Oberth. So that started a bit of a craze in Germany for rocketry. At about the same time, in the United States, Robert Goddard was experimenting with liquid-fueled rockets at the first time. This photo would have been taken about 1926 in Massachusetts. Werner would become aware of these experiments, as would the organizations he was a part of. So this was sort of the first stepping stone to Werner's later activities. And the other thing to keep in mind was Germany, towards the end of the decade, was starting to recover economically, if not politically. So Berlin was about the third largest city in the world at this time. It was considered to be a major hub of science, the arts, nightlife, and the cinema. And that is the world that he returned to after graduating from high school. So in 1930, he graduates, moves back to Berlin to pick up his university studies. While he was studying mechanical engineering, he got a job at the Borsig Works in town. And that was a major factor in his life because when he was first in that place, he didn't really appreciate the importance of being on a shop floor. And then the foreman got on him and made him learn how to machine various mundane objects that had no purpose for the manufacturing, but just to get him to appreciate the difficulty and the necessity of every single component within an assembly. So from that, he learned how to work a shop floor. And as he said later in life, it is necessary to keep your hands dirty to really know what is going on. So at the same time, he also joined the Spaceflight Society. We'll touch a little bit more on that on the next slide. But this was a group of people who were shooting off liquid-fueled rockets in the area around Berlin. So this tied in very closely with his interests. And you can actually see a photograph from the club. They had a periodical and somebody was able to get this out of it. This is Werner on the right, aged about 19, carrying one of the rockets that the club possessed. So in 1932, at age 20, he graduates from university with a diploma in mechanical engineering. He decides to keep it up, and by 1934, he graduated from a very prestigious university in Berlin with his PhD in physics. As was said about him at the time, he was very studious, very into everything that he did, but he was also noted for being very charismatic. One of the stories that was told about him was that he was able to date 2 women at a time. And by that, I don't mean just in general, but he was able to bring 2 girls along on the same date. So something fairly impressive, I think, for all of us. Anyway, as I mentioned, graduated with his PhD in only 2 years, age 22. Although his focus being a liquid propulsion for rockets, it remained classified by the West German government until 1960. But I mentioned this club, the Society for Space Travel, and this is really where he first had the opportunity to start living out his dreams. So this was founded in 1925 in Eastern Germany, in Breslau, before moving to Berlin. Again, Berlin being the happeningest place in continental Europe at the time. That was the place to be for talent. Their first successful liquid-fueled launch was in January 1930. And then after that, the city of Berlin let them use an old munitions depot for their launches. They also petitioned the army for backing, although that would come later. So to raise money, help recoup some of the costs from all of these builds and launches, they started charging admission for anybody who wanted to come and see. And as von Braun noted later in life, they never gave any refunds for failures or any fizzles. Anyways, they became better at what they were doing. The city became less happy with them being there. The rockets could be heard in the center of town, and at the heights they were starting to reach, they could start blowing more into town. However, the army by this point had gained an interest, and von Braun split off from this group to become a civilian employee of the army. And later the club closed very soon thereafter, 1934. One, because as they progressed, they needed more funding that was only coming from the army. 2, the local government in Berlin had had enough of them and chased them out of the site. And then there was a new government in power in Germany, which banned all civilian rocketry. So that spelled the end of that club. And this is where they were launching from Berlin. You can see the little red indicator towards the upper left middle. So you can pretty clearly see why the city government grew tired of having them there once the rockets started reaching several thousand feet. Anyway, by this point, Werner had moved on to the Army. They had tested a rocket or tried to demonstrate one at the Army research post in Kummersdorf. It failed at that site, but the Army was interested enough and they'd seen enough successes in Berlin to offer backing anyway. And von Braun was keen to accept. So this wouldn't be too surprising. One, he wanted the funding to continue the experiments, and two, he came from a family closely tied to the Army, so it would have been nothing for him to join in a military capacity. And why the Army was so interested is at this point, Germany was still operating under the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany had been banned as part of this treaty. There had been very strict controls on things such as artillery, tanks, and aircraft development, but it didn't touch on any new technologies. And so as rockets became more prominent, the Army realized this would be a way to deliver munitions and ordnance long range. So this was something they were very keen to develop. And von Braun was attached to the Army Ordnance Department under the Colonel Walter Dornberger. He was the CEO of the site in Kummersdorf and was very prominent in other rocket developments, both in Germany and later in the United States. So what's going on in the world this time? I mentioned a change in government. This photo is of the last truly democratically elected government in Germany. That's the Chancellor von Papen, second from the right, seated. More interesting is who's on the far left. That is actually Magnus von Braun. That's Werner's father. He was the Minister for Nutrition and Agriculture in the national government in Berlin at the beginning of the 30s. But things were changing very rapidly. I mentioned Germany had been recovering economically, but not politically. There was a lot of violence between the far left and the far right. And that culminated in 1933 with a new group that had a new way of doing things. This is a sample ballot from the November 1933 election. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Hitler Movement, had made elections very easy to take part in, as they had the exact same 10 names in this exact same style ballot, every polling precinct in the country. And here were the election results that followed. Very clearly in complete control of the country at this point. His father had zero interest in joining this crew. So the Nazis, their base of support was from the workers who were more interested in smashing up the old ways. That's not something that really appealed to the old nobility. So his father basically said, the heck with this, I'm retiring, and went back to his farm in Silesia. Sigismund, Werner's older brother, and Werner seemed to just have been uninterested in all of these developments. However, Werner's younger brother was a little bit more caught up in it, but he was 13 when the Nazis came to power. So he got the whole indoctrination spiel, the Hitler Youth, and was more excited by it. But the long and the short of it was the Nazi government was now in power. So at the same time, Werner was working for the army, and he was progressing in the 1930s towards his A4 rocket. So starting in 1933, he had some squabbles with the civilian bureaucracy. They were unhappy about all the money the army was spending on rocketry, but because that had been set up in the official budgets to be spent, they couldn't cut that. So their way to try and cut the costs of this development was to cut off all their office supplies. So it was actually kind of entertaining looking and seeing how Colonel Dornberger and von Braun got around this. And the way they did it was they simply made all their requests for office supplies as technical as they could so that the secretaries in Berlin would just stamp approved. So for example, one of the things they ordered was an appliance for milling wooden dowels up to 10 millimeters in diameter. So that's how they ordered new pencil sharpeners. And it was that sort of games that allowed them to continue their progress in the early 30s. But by 1934, von Braun, age 22, is now leading a team of 80 at Kummersdorf, about 25 miles south of Berlin, in rocket development. And very soon they had their first working rocket for the Army, the A1. which delivered about 600 pounds of thrust. So before, when he was in this club, they were reaching heights about 3,000 feet. The A1 could reach about 1.5 miles high. The next rocket, the A2, 600 pounds of thrust, so the same, but its key innovation was having separate propellant tanks. And from there, they started scaling it up to the A3, which had 30,000 pounds of thrust. And by this point, they had already outgrown their site at Kummersdorf, and so they relocated to a new site, Peenemünde, 125 miles north of Berlin. So this just shows the scale of these early rockets. We'll get to the A4 later. I think a lot of people will recognize that's a familiar shape. But you can see the A1, slightly longer A2, and then the A3. And this just shows the progression from Berlin south to Kummersdorf, and then you can see north where they are on the Baltic, on the island of Peenemünde. So this site has some significance. In 1935, the Air Force had tried to recruit von Braun. The Army, though, was keen to keep him in their employ, so they promised him even more funding if he stayed, including the new site, which they mentioned was already needed when they'd outgrown Kummersdorf. And the site was actually suggested by Werner's mother, as Werner's father had hunted there when he was younger. So I knew it was a good site, easy to get to, but still isolated, next to water. So already by 1937, he's 25 years old, and now he's leading a team of 400 researchers at a major army facility. Said it was one of the 5 largest installations in Germany, costing hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. And some of the main things they were doing there was liquid fuel rocketry, which was under von Braun, and also JATO, jet-assisted takeoff for aircraft, but that was much smaller scale. So it was both an army, and then it was a small Air Force site there too. And they used this place to develop later their V1 and V2 weapons. And this just gives you a idea of the scale of the site. So just the end of this peninsula is about 4 miles long by 2 miles wide. So definitely one of the biggest such research installations in all of Europe at the time. But by this point, back in the political sphere, so Germany had begun flaunting the Versailles Treaty and was openly rearming in the late 1930s. They annexed Austria and the Czech Republic, and very soon thereafter, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agreed to divide all of Eastern Europe up between them in separate spheres of influence, starting by conquering and dividing Poland between them. And that's exactly what happened. On September 1st, 1939, Germany and Russia invaded Poland, and the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany as part of their agreement with Poland. So World War II was on. And with that came even more resources for weapons development, as well as a lot of the controversy surrounding von Braun. As he was now a major figure at this point, he had lots of interactions with Hitler and with the Nazi Party. So already starting in 1933, the very same year that the Nazis came to power, he joined an SS equestrian group, but then promptly quit. From my reading of it, looks like he was interested in just learning how to ride horseback, and as soon as he passed the camp, he'd had enough and left. Later, though, he joined the party in 1937. That, though, doesn't appear to be all voluntary. It seems like he was being pushed to do so, to help continue with the funding. He met Hitler for the first time March 27th, 1939, as part of his appeal to increase the funding for rocketry. Now, Hitler initially had crossed rocketry off his list of things he was interested in. And reading from the armaments minister in Germany, he described Hitler's personality as the sort of person who had zero interest in the nuts and bolts of what was going on, but loved the exotic. So he would have had no interest in, say, developing submachine guns for the army, but a rocket with more mythological or wonder weapon connotations, that was something more interesting to him. So they had this meeting, was able to have increased funding for his rockets. In 1940, then, he was given a commission in the SS. Now, this is the same group that he had voluntarily joined before and quit. This time, he was simply given the commission. So what was going on here? The SS was the paramilitary group that ran the concentration camps and ultimately the Holocaust in Europe. Heinrich Himmler was the guy in charge, and he handed out commissions to anybody in Germany who was prominent. As was said about him, he was interested in having his fingers in as many pies as possible, and that included rocketry. So that's how Werner ended up with his SS commission. Then December 22nd, 1942, von Braun met with Hitler again in East Prussia, this time including film footage of his latest rocket, the A4. And Hitler was so excited by this new wonder weapon that he ordered a massive increase of resources to be devoted to it, and then also gave it a new name, the V2. So von Braun, much more apolitical, was naming his rockets Aggregat 1, 2, 3, and 4. What that means is sum total 1, sum total 2, and so on. V stood for Vergeltung, translating as vengeance. So that's the name that rocket's more commonly known by. And with it, Hitler set a production target of 2,000 per month. Later in 1943, von Braun was able to send color film as part of another demonstration of this rocket to Hitler. And that's why he was given a full professorship. Strange way of doing things, but these were very strange people. So this photo was taken at the 1942 meeting, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see Hitler in the very front row middle. And if you go straight back, you can see von Braun in a civilian suit, which is also something that jumps out at me for a meeting like this to have no Nazi Party insignia on him. As was mentioned, he and his brother seemed much more ambivalent about this crew running the country. But this led to more funding, and it led to his V2. So June 13th, 1942, they had their first flight. October 3rd, 1942, they had their first successful flight. And that's where they had the footage to show Hitler to even increase the funding past that. This is also prominent because this flight reached an altitude of 53 miles. So that was the first time any object had crossed what NASA considers to be the threshold of space. Then on June 20th, 1944, they set their wartime record, 109 miles vertically. So Werner was always much more interested in sending these rockets vertically than horizontally. And then on September 8th, 1944, the Vengeance weapon started living up to its name. That was the first bombing of London. And as Werner said at the time, it was overheard, the rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet. Very dangerous talk for somebody in his line of work at this time. This is an image of one of the successful launches that they had. What makes this rocket so unique and so special is a major leap forward with the turbo pumps rotating at 4,000 RPM, pumping 58 kilograms per second of alcohol and water and 72 kilograms per second of liquid oxygen together to generate the explosion. So what would result is 5,100 degree Fahrenheit combustion exiting the back at 6,500 feet per second. This generated 55,000 pounds of thrust. So the rocket was able to reach max speed of 3,500 miles per hour, carrying a 2,200 pound warhead approximately 200 miles. This was the world's first ballistic missile. The results? They built 5,000 rockets, were able to fire off 3,000. Guidance, though, was a major issue. Only about half reached their targets. And the result was they killed, there's a range of estimates, but the maximum is 9,000 were killed as a result of these direct strikes. In the process, though, 12,000 workers died making it. They had serious production problems, which led to intellectuals, less popular engineers and scientists, being recalled from frontline duty fighting the Russians to help support the development. And they were concerned about security, so their idea was to use concentration camp labor to manufacture it. Initially, they were manufactured on site at Peenemünde in the Baltic. After the British bombed it in 1943, they built a subterranean factory in the middle of Germany near another concentration camp. And conditions there were poor. That led to, as a minimum of 12,000, possibly as many as 20,000 workers, perhaps as many as a third of the workforce died during the production. Now, von Braun said after the war that he was oblivious to that, but it's pretty clear that he was visiting that site, and he pretty clearly knew, if not the full extent of the conditions, at least the problems involved and the state of using concentration camp labor. As was pointed out, there are records of his private plane flying to that site. More problematic for Germany was that resources were diverted to this project for more useful projects, such as the Me-262, the jet fighter, and the Waterfall missile, a surface-to-air missile. I think the armaments minister summed it up best when he wrote in his memoirs, "From the end of July 1943 on, tremendous industrial capacity was diverted to the huge missile, later known as the V-2, a rocket 46 feet long and weighing more than 13 metric tons. The whole notion was absurd. The fleets of enemy bombers in 1944 were dropping an average of 3,000 tons of bombs a day over a span of several months, and Hitler wanted to retaliate with 30 rockets that would have carried 24 tons of explosives to England daily. That was equivalent to a bomb load of only 12 flying fortresses." So this rocket might have had a future with the warhead they had on it and the guidance. It was useless to Germany's war efforts. Although beneficial for the United States, it probably helped us by diverting resources to it instead of the jets and their surface-to-air missiles. And the end result was that Germany spent approximately 50% more on the V-2 than we did on the Manhattan Project. And these were the results. As somebody once said to me, they spent $100,000 building a rocket to blow up a $10,000 house. Continuing the adventures or misadventures at this time frame, Werner was also having run-ins with the secret police. In February 1944, he was called out to East Prussia by Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the Gestapo. Himmler wanted to attach SS resources to the project at Peenemünde, officially to help speed the project along. Unofficially, Heinrich Himmler wanted more control over it himself. He was rebuffed at that point, but he had a grudge. And so in March 1944, when Werner was overheard by secret police discussing the war as a waste and his desire to use his rockets for space travel instead, he was arrested and taken to nearby Stettin to spend 2 weeks in solitary confinement before the army leadership and the armaments minister himself were able to free him. At the same time, Germany was beginning to collapse. So this was the Germany that was supplying him unlimited resources as a sort of Manhattan Project, but it was already shrinking. This was the military situation in June 1944. By December, France had been regained and the Allies were pushing at the borders of Germany. By the spring of 1945, the Russians had been successfully crossed the border. And by May of 1945, the situation was completely hopeless for the German military. This is about the point where they surrendered. But at this point, Werner had decided that with the Russians on the way, he was going to try and surrender to the United States. He and his team as a whole had already made that decision in 1944. And in February 1945, the opportunity arose. Wernher von Braun received conflicting orders from the military leadership. The first, destroy all V2 materials, pick up a gun, and join the fight on the Eastern Front against the Russians. And his second order was to evacuate all personnel to safekeeping in central Germany. He picked door number 2. This is the first time it was also really documented that he wore his SS uniform to help lead his convoy of 5,000 personnel and as many materials as possible to central Germany. And he refused the order to destroy the materials. He hid them there in Turingen. March 1945, he made his last official visit to Berlin, but got in a car crash which broke his arm. Then on April 2nd, 1945, the SS leadership removed him from central Germany and took him to Oberammergau in the Alps. Their idea was to use him as a hostage as part of surrender negotiations, so they knew he was valuable. He had other ideas and convinced the local SS lieutenant to move the rocket personnel out of Oberammergau to a small town called Oberjoch nearby. And ironically enough, I've actually been to this ski resort. I'm not sure which house von Braun was staying in, but this is actually a picture of the town. At the same time, the United States launched Operation Paperclip. So March 1945, the chief of the U.S. Army Ordnance Branch was given responsibility for capturing V-2s and given a blacklist of key personnel. Von Braun's name was at the top. The idea behind this operation, rather than let all this German talent starve in the ruins at the end of the war or fall into Russian hands, we would take them to the United States, where we could at least make them useful, supporting our own industry and military development. So on May 2nd, 1945, after it was clear that Germany was surrendered and Hitler was dead, Werner sent his younger brother Magnus out to find the U.S. Army, which they knew was nearby. So he set off on a bike, headed downhill, and ran into a U.S. Army private, said in broken English, "My name is Magnus Von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." So it was the jackpot for that particular unit. 3 weeks later, the order was given, consolidate all rocket scientists in the U.S. zone. And using the information that von Braun had supplied, we evacuated as much of the materials and the documents out of what would soon be the Russian zone as we could and sent them to the United States. And amongst them, September 29th, we sent von Braun himself. He arrived in Boston that day and was put on a train for his next position at Fort Bliss, Texas. And with him went 127 scientists, engineers, 100 V2s, and other documents that we recovered from the British zone. So this is a picture taken from his capture. He's in the center with the broken arm. To his right, our left, was his old boss, now General Dornberger, and partially obscured, that's his younger brother, Magnus. And now we're in the United States. This was a picture of the whole crew taken at Fort Bliss, Texas, around 1946. And von Braun is in the front row, a little to the right. So the world in 1945 at this time, Germany is no more. It's now 4 occupation zones, the 5th if you include Poland. So at this point now, his father lost his estate in Silesia, and he joined his sons and the whole family in El Paso, Texas, which must have been quite a shock for an old German aristocrat in 1945. And the purple zone you can see in the center is where most of the records and materials for the V2 were stashed. And we evacuated them while we still controlled it before handing it over to the Russians. So let's turn now to America's first ballistic missile, coincidentally, the V2. So as I mentioned, he was stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas. The White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico were to be the launch site, located very close nearby. May 10th, 1946 was their first launch from New Mexico. October 1946 was an achievement, the first picture taken from outer space. February 1947, the first animals reached outer space. So a lot of people think it was the dog the Russians sent up in 1957. We actually beat them by 10 years, but nobody wants to stick fruit flies on a stamp. So they're not as well known. Then on May 13th, 1948, we launched our first 2-stage rocket. So here's Wernher von Braun in New Mexico at the White Sands Proving Ground with our first ballistic missile. This is the first two-stage launch, the V2 WAC Corporal. You can see the main body of the V2 below and the WAC Corporal on the top. And this is the first picture ever taken from outer space. However, von Braun was generally unhappy at the time. He was mostly there advising and assisting. He was no longer leading anything. In Germany, he'd been the head of a Manhattan project, and in the United States, he was reporting to an army major who was very good at saying no to spending money. However, that began to change. 1950, at this point, the Cold War is very much in effect, and it turned hot in Korea. And with that came new army requirements for an intermediate range ballistic missile. And they set von Braun to work on that. With that, he moved to Huntsville, Alabama, as rocket development was made a permanent part of U.S. military research, and the Army consolidated all of its operations into their former chemical plant in Huntsville, the Redstone Arsenal. So April 1st, 1950, the German scientists relocated from Fort Bliss to Alabama. As I mentioned, as a direct result of the Korean War, a new missile was required. This is about the time where he really becomes incorporated into American culture. So he was part of the town in Huntsville, helping build churches and volunteering in the schools, writing for the local newspaper, giving interviews. He also published a series of articles for major magazines in 1952. And from that, it only snowballed. He consulted Walt Disney for 3 made-for-TV movies, the first of which was seen by 40 million people, and became an American citizen in 1955. So here you can see him in publicity still with Walt Disney. And here he is consulting the civilian predecessor to NASA, the NACA. You will note by this point he's at the head of the table. The results: the Redstone Rocket, also known as Jupiter C and Juno amongst its various states. It was a 3-stage rocket. Could have 4 stages for orbiting satellites. The second and third stages housed a rotating tub, eliminating the need for guidance in the upper stages, and it generated a thrust of 83,000 pounds in the first stage, a 50% increase over the single-stage V2. And it could fire a 7,000-pound payload, in this case a W-39 nuclear warhead 175 miles. You can see it there on the redstone on the left, the satellite orbiting Jupiter C in the middle, and the Mercury variation, which was used for manned spaceflight, to the right. And this is an example of the famous rotating tub. And this particular picture was taken in downtown Detroit. That's actually the Guardian building that you can see in the background. So, at this point, it came down to a competition, Jupiter or Vanguard. The United States had a stated desire to launch a satellite in either 1957 or 1958 as part of the International Geophysical Year. Von Braun said, why wait? We're ready to go now with Jupiter C. Let's launch something in 1956. The Eisenhower administration, though, rejected his proposal. Their concerns were first, they didn't want to have a purely military vehicle designed almost exclusively by former Nazis delivering the first American satellite to orbit. They instead wanted something else. They also decided to delineate who would be responsible for what between the Air Force, Army, and Navy, as all of them had rocketry programs. The Navy would have sea-based missiles, Air Force would get the ICBMs, and Army would get the IRBMs, which was a problem because the Army had started developing a new project called Saturn. So the Navy's Vanguard was selected for the first satellite launch. The Air Force's Atlas and Titans would be our intercontinental ballistic missiles. But all the calculations changed on October 4th, 1957, when the Russians orbited their first satellite, Sputnik 1. We decided to answer as quickly as possible. December 6th, Vanguard launched and failed spectacularly on live TV. Von Braun was given 60 days to put his Jupiter C, or Juno is called at this point, into action, and he did so January 31st, 1958, when he put Explorer into Earth orbit. This is the famous Sputnik. And this is what happened when Vanguard tried to launch in 57. No such problems for the Army rocket. It took off with flying colors, making Von Braun the hero of the day. There he is holding a replica of the satellite, and he's behind the scale model of his rocket. So this led to the establishment of NASA. October 1st, 1958. Though Von Braun was a little later in being amalgamated into it. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency and his team only joined in 1960, and he agreed on one condition. The Army Saturn project would be allowed to continue. So once that was agreed upon, he joined NASA, first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And the Army Project Atom, which was designed to put a man into space, was incorporated into the civilian project, later known as Mercury. This is a photo of Eisenhower's final visit to the Huntsville site. So Diane, how are we doing on time?
8 minutes.
8. Might have to split this up into 2 presentations, but we'll continue for now. Project Mercury. So this was the plan to put our original 7 American astronauts into orbit. The 7 were unveiled April 9th, 1959. First 3 missions in 1961 were to be suborbital, using the modified Army Redstone Rocket. Again, this changed when the Soviets orbited Yuri Gagarin, April 12th, 1961, although we followed them soon thereafter when we put Alan Shepard into space using Redstone on May 5th, 1961. And Alan Shepard was forever bitter at Wernher von Braun for that, as we put a chimpanzee into space on January 31st that year, but there were a couple of minor glitches in the Redstone rocket. So rather than launch Alan Shepard in March as originally planned, we launched another test just to make sure all the bugs were worked out. That allowed the Soviets to launch first, and Alan Shepard had to settle for being the second man in space. But pretty soon after that happened, at the end of May 1961, Von Braun met President Kennedy, and they discussed how to continue the space race. Von Braun told Kennedy that it was too late to beat the Russians into orbit, obviously. And at this point, it'd be too late to beat them to doing anything in Earth orbit, but they could still go to the moon, and they could probably do that first. Kennedy asked what it would cost, and Von Braun gave him a spitball figure, $20 to $25 billion. Kennedy basically said, okay, let's do it. 3 weeks later, he announced to a very stunned America that America was going to the moon and was going to do so before 1970. So that took us through Project Mercury. In the end, only 2 were suborbital. That's the Army's Redstone rocket on the left. The final 4 were orbital flights using the more powerful Atlas rocket supplied by the Air Force, once they got it to work. This takes us to the next project that Von Braun was involved in, Apollo. This ran from 1961 to 1972, concurrent with Mercury and Gemini. It was dedicated to achieving Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before 1970, although the means was still up for debate in the early years. Von Braun favored a direct descent, where we would launch 1 spacecraft right at the moon and land that, which would require something much bigger than even the Saturn V, which we had already developed, or at least drawn out. And there were a lot of bitter fights about this, including at a public press conference where Kennedy's scientific advisor interrupted a presentation Von Braun was giving, and Kennedy was just sort of stuck in the middle, refereeing. But in the end, they went with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. So that's where 1 Saturn V would send up 2 vehicles, the main spacecraft and the lunar lander. But even that would require something far beyond anything ever built before. And you can see the sneak peek of it there. So Dan, we might have to cut it there, do questions for 5 minutes, and make the Apollo mission a short talk later. What do you say?
I can totally get down with that because I love hearing about Apollo, so delayed gratification is fine by me. I would love to open this to questions for Mark's excellent presentation.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, Jim.
We heard you and then we didn't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, sorry. Mark, that was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot about Von Braun, and I knew an awful lot before. He was one of my heroes. I'm 83 years old, so I was around back in the 50s when all this was going on, and I actually have a letter from Von Braun when we invited him to one of our Rocket Club meetings back in those days. But you didn't mention too much about, you did mention about his experiences at White Sands and into the early 50s. He was a rather frustrated person because he knew things were going on in the Soviet Union. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I don't know how much was publicly known at the time, but the Russians were certainly pouring far more resources into rocketry than we were in the late 40s and the early 1950s. So von Braun, when he was brought over to the United States, he was more of a technical advisor. We were shooting off the existing V2s, making some modifications to them, but generally we weren't really advancing at that point. As I mentioned, he'd gone from being at the head of a Manhattan project to reporting to an army major who had very little interest in spending cash. So was always saying no to a lot of the ideas that were being proposed because they require further development, require further funding, which they probably didn't have. So again, he was very disappointed and frustrated for those first 5 years. Although he did decide by that point he was staying in the United States, as he put himself on the path to citizenship in 1950. And he married and brought his family to the United States in the late 40s.
Just one follow-up on that. There was in several accounts I read were that the Russians actually made an attempt to try to kidnap him while he was still over there before he came to the United States. Do you recall any incidents, any accounts of that?
It wouldn't surprise me if they tried to do so. I didn't read any accounts when I was putting this presentation together. It would have been very difficult to pull off because, again, he was the #1 name in Operation Paperclip for rocketry. So as soon as we had him, he and his whole team were under pretty heavy guard by the United States Army. So there have been quite a few people that have had to fight their way through just to try and get to him.
Thanks.
Mark, do you know, did he ever apologize for the V2 project at Pianamunda and before, or express regret about it?
I don't know if he ever formally apologized. I'd have to double check that. Certainly there was some regret, as I've seen some of the statements that he made. There was some conjecture that the reason why he became so involved with the church after World War II was making amends for what he had been involved in Nazi Germany. I don't know if he ever gave a formal apology for that. It would surprise me a little bit because, again, coming from the sort of background where the sort of the father and the grandfather being in the army, sort of that sort of national conservative viewpoint, he was a part of Germany's war effort. Germany was his country, and he was going to support it.
So, Mark, in keeping with what Jonathan asked, I think you said earlier he denied that he was aware of the basically slave labor deaths on his projects. Did he ever admit any, guilt, wrongdoing, regret for the shocking number of lives lost building his stuff?
I have not seen any report of that either. Again, he denied any knowledge of it up through his death. My gut feeling is he was worried about losing his American citizenship, which would be a complication for admitting any of that. That's just my gut feel from reading him.
Okay, so copying to war crimes would have had consequences. Okay.
As it was, only one person, I think, from the rocketry group, as part of Operation Paperclip, was ever accused of war crimes and deported back to Germany. That was after von Braun's death. Now, there were other people who accused von Braun personally after he had died of being more closely involved than even he had indicated. As I mentioned, the private airline flights clearly showed him visiting the underground factory in the middle of Germany. But there were a few people who were saying, well, no, I ran into him when he was there and he was really sadistic. And there was a historian who looked into all of those accounts. And he said 98 of them out of the 100 were people trying to get on TV, and their accounts wouldn't have worked. But there were 2 that were possibilities. But from his reading of them, it wasn't actually Werner that sounded like he was reading. It sounded more like it was Werner's younger brother, Magnus von Braun. And Magnus, being younger, was more into some of the Nazi ideology at the time. Again, he was 13 years old when they came to power. And so he had more of the indoctrination, where his brothers were older, had more time to grow up amongst the old nobility, and were sort of more rolling their eyes at a lot of the Nazi ideology.
Interesting. Any more questions for Mark? We can go long since we've got nowhere to drive and no snacks to clean up.
Do you ever remember hearing that song by Tom Lehrer?
Yes, I actually came across it when I was doing my research. The one where he was singing about I want to go to the stars, but accidentally hit London instead.
When rockets go up, who cares where they come down? It's not my department, says Wernher von Braun.
Excellent, John.
Yeah.
Yes, you can watch the video on YouTube and hear the song again.
Nazi schmatzi. Okay, that was great. Really was great.
Mark, did you ever hear Jim Shedlowski's song about Peenemünde?
Probably.
I
But
believe
it's
it's
no
on
longer
YouTube.
sticking in my memory.
One of Jim's wonderful great hits played at our astronomy club meetings.
That was wonderful.
Very good. More questions?
Nope.
All right. Well, I am super looking forward to part 2, Mark. Take as long as you like going into the details of Apollo, because this was a great first half.
Oops, next time I'll time it better.
You did great. You have nothing to apologize for. You did
Excellent
wonderful.
presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, we, as I said, we don't have any snacks to clean up, and we don't have any gastronomy to meet up and talk things over. So I think we can let the chat room open a bit and let everybody cool down informally as best they can. And we will see you all one way or another at either a discussion group or a virtual open house at the end of the month.
Yeah, people hoping. It's clear out, so they're going to open up.
All righty.
Bob, I have to call you, Bob Tremblay. Available? Are you available for me to call you, Bob Tremblay? Tremblay.
Yeah, we have scheduled for the weekend. Did you want to do it earlier?
I have something very cool to do with you, right? If you're around, I'll call you after the meeting.
Okay, go ahead.
Good enough. Okay.
Bye all.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Mark, and I will talk to everybody soon.
Adios.
Great job there, Mark.
I did want to soon.